Thorns of the Waking Court, a video novel by SDC Multimedia. Watch it like a movie, read it like a novel, or listen to it like a podcast. Chapter 8. Mother's Sacrifice. The grove breathed around Calla, a slow, ancient rhythm that resonated in her very bones. She sat at the gnarled foot of a blackroot tree, its colossal limbs curling over her like a skeletal cradle, branches woven with the faint, violet luminescence that was the grove's own heartbeat. The air here was cool, damp, smelling of rich, overturned soil and the sharp, metallic tang of deep roots. The moss covered the ground, illuminating emerald spores and the delicate, crystalline dewdrops that clung to the intricate web of roots. Her fingers idly toyed with a shard of old bone, smooth and cool against her skin, that she'd found half embedded in the velvety moss. It wasn't human, not anymore. The hollow didn't bury its dead, it consumed them. The bone hummed faintly, a ghost of the life it once held, a silent testament to the relentless reclamation of this place. The grove itself whispered, low and intimate, not in words, not in a language she could parse with her mind, but in pulses that beat against the fragile membrane of her awareness. A flicker of longing, so profound it was almost a physical ache. A thread of memory, fleeting and half-formed, like the scent of a storm long past. A taste, sharp and visceral, of blood and lilies, a paradox that haunted her. She pressed a palm over the sigil on her wrist, a swirling pattern of roots and light that now pulsed in tandem with the grove's silent song, as if the pressure might quiet the incessant, almost overwhelming hum that thrummed beneath her skin. It was more than a mark, it was a conduit, a living, breathing connection she was still learning to navigate. Calla. The voice was soft, careful, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the grove's pervasive hum. She looked up, her gaze tracing the path of the voice through the shifting shadows. Elias stood at the edge of the glade, framed by the violet rootlight that pulsed from the grove's deepest veins, creating a soft, ethereal halo around his silhouette. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but the bruising beneath his eyes wasn't from exhaustion. Not truly. It was from what he carried, a visible weight of unspoken burdens and weary knowledge. His usually sharp features were softened by the muted light, his expression etched with a familiar sorrow. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if afraid of disturbing the ancient peace of the grove. She arched a brow, a flicker of her usual defiance returning despite the emotional maelstrom within her. "And yet here you are." He hesitated, a shadow of a smile playing on his lips, then crossed the mossy ground to her, his steps surprisingly light. He sat opposite her, his knees almost touching hers, the blackroot tree's ancient bulk looming behind him. The grove, she noted, didn't recoil from him, but it didn't embrace him either. There was a polite distance, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence, but none of the deep, resonant connection it offered her. It was as if this sacred space recognized him as an outsider, albeit one who respected its boundaries. "I saw Riven speaking with you earlier," Elias said, his gaze drifting over the shimmering light of the glade. "He has a way of getting under people's skin. He whispers half-truths, questions that bloom like poison ivy." Calla didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the way the violet light illuminated the intricate moss patterns on the blackroot's bark. Riven's words had indeed been insidious, planting seeds of doubt about Elias, about the court, about everything she thought she knew. Elias looked down at the bone shard in her hands, then past it, to the roots that twisted like veins, ancient and pulsing, through the glade. His expression grew distant, haunted. "This place remembers oaths," he said, his voice lower now, almost a murmur against the grove's silent hum. "It feeds on them, especially the broken ones." Something shifted in her chest, a cold premonition blooming like frost. The hum of the grove intensified, no longer soothing but sharpening into a low, dissonant chord. Broken oaths. The words resonated with the unspoken longing she'd felt from the grove moments before. "Is that why you're here?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "To break another one?" He lifted his gaze slowly, his eyes meeting hers, dark and fathomless in the root light. "No," he said quietly, his voice heavy with conviction. "I'm here to honor one." He didn't look at her when he spoke again, his eyes instead fixed on the darkened soil between them, as if the answers lay buried within its depths. The silence thickened, punctuated only by the distant calls of unseen creatures and the ever-present thrum of the grove. "Your mother once stood where you do now," he began, his voice taking on a narrative quality, as if recounting an ancient legend. "Before the court, before the pact, before everything fell apart." Calla's pulse slowed, a strange, breathless anticipation seizing her. Her mother, a phantom, a whisper, a force she felt but had never known. "You knew her." It wasn't a question, but a statement of sudden, shocking revelation. "Yes," Elias affirmed, a profound sadness in his tone. "And so did Aerith." A thick, almost suffocating silence descended between them, heavy with unspoken history. The name Aerith, once associated with mystery and power, now carried a new, unsettling resonance. "She trusted him," Elias continued, his voice barely audible, as if speaking secrets to the earth itself. "Too much, and in ways that made her vulnerable to the very system he served." "She loved him," Calla whispered, the words escaping her before she even realized she'd formed them. She didn't know how she knew this, hadn't a single memory of it, yet the certainty resonated in her very core. It was a knowing born, not of intellect, but of the deep, ancient connection to the grove, a memory echoed through the pulsing roots. Elias nodded once, a gesture of profound weariness. And he loved her, but not enough to defy the Chancellor. Calla's stomach turned, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. Then he didn't love her at all. Maybe not the way she needed him to, Elias conceded, his gaze still fixed on the earth. But enough that when the Chancellor turned against her, Aerith did nothing to stop it. He stood by. He watched. "Why?" Calla demanded, a cold anger beginning to coil in her gut. "Because your mother made a choice." Elias finally looked at her, his eyes piercing through the violet haze. "She broke a blood oath, a fundamental law of the Hollow." Calla blinked, the air suddenly thin and sharp in her lungs. "What oath?" Elias's voice dropped, raw with the pain of the memory. "To give you up." The words hit Calla like a physical slap, stealing her breath. The blackroot cradle behind her seemed to shift, and the sigil on her wrist pulsed with an agonizing throb. "She was bound to the grove, same as you," Elias explained, his voice low and steady now, as if steeling himself for the inevitable. Not merely a seeker, but someone with a deeper, rarer bond, one that could weave the very fabric of this place. But the Chancellor feared what that bond could mean, what it could birth, what power a child of the grove might wield. So when she became pregnant, she was given a choice. Surrender the child to the court to be raised as an instrument of their will, or die. Calla's mouth went dry, every drop of moisture seemingly sucked away by the chilling revelation. "And she chose me." "She ran," Elias corrected, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that demanded she understand the full weight of her mother's sacrifice. vanished into the outer wilds, beyond the Chancellor's immediate reach. The grove helped her hide. It wove illusions around her, whispered false trails to her pursuers, swallowed her footsteps into its own silent embrace. For a time, she was truly free. The shard of bone, forgotten in her trembling hands, slipped, cutting her palm with a sharp sting. She didn't notice the warm trickle of blood, her senses overwhelmed by the torrent of emotion and information. "What happened?" she managed to choke out, her voice raw. "The Chancellor found her," Elias said, a dark note entering his voice. "Perhaps through a spy, perhaps through the relentless tracking of the Seekers, dragged her back to the Hollow, forced her to kneel before the court, before all the ruling elders and the Watchers, and confess her betrayal, her defiance. Aerith was there, right beside the Chancellor, his face a mask. He said nothing. He watched. Calla's throat tightened, a bitter ball of anguish forming in her chest. The pain of her mother's betrayal, so ancient and personal, resonated with her own deep-seated fear of abandonment. And then? They didn't kill her. Elias's voice cracked then, the carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. A single tear tracked a path down his weathered cheek, illuminated by the root light. That would have been mercy. He looked directly at the immense blackroot tree, his gaze filled with a profound, aching sorrow. They rooted her. Calla stared at him, unable to comprehend the words. Rooted her? The concept was monstrous, a violation of the very essence of life. They bound her, Elias clarified, his voice a ragged whisper, to the Garden of Broken Vows. This tree, he pointed to the colossal blackroot cradle that towered over them, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky like tormented arms. That's her now. Her life force, her essence, woven into the very wood and root. She is a part of it, trapped, eternally awake. The silence that followed was unbearable, a crushing weight that pressed down on Calla from all sides. The grove's hum, no longer distant, pulsed with the same agony that now coursed through her veins. Calla rose, trembling, her legs unsteady beneath her. She took a hesitant step toward the blackroot tree, then another, drawn by an invisible thread. Her hand, still bleeding faintly from the cut, reached out, her fingers brushing against the ancient, ridged bark. It was cold, rough, yet beneath her palm she felt it, a faint, undeniable pulse. Not a greeting, not a warning, something in between, a sustained note of sorrow, a desperate, silent plea for release. She fell to her knees before the tree, the moss soft beneath her. The sigil on her wrist flared with a searing intensity, a connection forging between her and the suffering heart of the grove. Memories that weren't hers began to surface, not as clear visions, but as impressions, echoes. Laughter, bright and full, under a sun that felt warmer than any she'd ever known. The crackle of firelight on a hearth, casting dancing shadows on a loving face. And then, a lullaby, sung in a voice she didn't recognize, a voice that was both ancient and achingly familiar, a melody that filled her with a profound, wrenching longing she couldn't explain but suddenly ached for with every fiber of her being. The blood on her palm throbbed, a direct conduit to her mother's perpetual agony. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice choked with unshed tears, her gaze fixed on the pulsing bark of the blackroot. "Because you've inherited more than her magic," Elias said, his voice softer now, tinged with a solemn reverence. He had moved closer, standing over her, a protective shadow. "You've inherited her enemies, and her unfinished war." The thought of war, any war, especially one rooted in such profound personal tragedy, was abhorrent to her. "I don't want a war," she whispered, tears finally escaping and tracing warm paths down her cheeks. He stepped closer still, his hand hovering over her shoulder, a gesture of comfort he didn't quite complete. "Then don't repeat her mistake. Don't trust the wrong person." She looked at him then, her eyes swimming with tears, the violet light reflecting in their depths. The question burned on her lips, one that suddenly held a terrible new weight. "Who was the wrong person?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aerith?" Elias didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding the unspoken truth of a long, painful history, a truth too complex, too dangerous, to articulate in words. The silence was his answer, and it was deafening. Calla didn't sleep. Sleep was a distant, unreachable shore. She lay on the cold stone floor of her chamber within the ancient, root-bound walls of the Seeker's cloister, wrapped in a cloak of moss and silence, the grove still humming in her blood, no longer a distant whisper, but a roaring current. Every fiber of her being resonated with the black root's tortured pulse, with the echo of her mother's rooted agony. Dreams came, but they were not her own. They were vivid, aching fragments of another's life, playing out behind her closed eyelids with horrifying clarity. She saw a woman with ash-dark hair, flowing like a midnight river, and skin like rich earth, scarred but radiant. This woman walked barefoot through the hollow, her steps deliberate, her gaze holding a fire that seemed to challenge the very shadows around her. There was a secret on her lips, a truth she carried like a precious, fragile burden, a knowing that set her apart. Calla felt the boundless joy, the fierce love, and the deep, pervasive fear that permeated this woman's existence. She saw Aerith as he once was, unmasked, unscarred, before the shadows had claimed his face and the weight of the court had bent his back. He was young, startlingly beautiful, and burdened by a profound fear. Was it fear of the Chancellor, or fear of the love he felt, a love that would demand a sacrifice he was unwilling or unable to make? He stood beside her mother, their hands clasped, a silent promise exchanged between them that was destined to break. Then, she saw the Chancellor's shadow fall across them both, vast and menacing, like a blade descending. It wasn't a physical presence, but a palpable aura of power, of oppressive judgment, of absolute, unquestioning authority. The light around her mother dimmed, the joy flickering, the love turning to a desperate, defiant resolve. And finally, she saw herself, an infant, cradled in root light, glowing with the very same sigil she bore now on her wrist. The warmth of the roots around her, a gentle embrace, the lullaby her mother had sung woven into the very fabric of the light. She was a secret, a hope, a defiance. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, stained with tears that felt ancient, not her own. The ache in her chest was profound, a grief for a life lost, a love betrayed, a fate unjustly sealed. The grove said nothing in words, but she could feel its ache, mirroring her own. She felt its hunger, a longing for balance, for restitution. And then, woven through the sorrow and the hunger, she felt its promise, a silent, unwavering vow that resonated deep within her soul. Her mother had made a vow of defiance, of fierce, uncompromising love. She had chosen life, even at the cost of her own freedom. She had begun a fight that had consumed her. Calla would finish it, even if it cost her everything. End of chapter 8.